The fluorescent lights above the nursing station buzzed like angry wasps as Margaret from HR cornered me during the busiest shift of the week. The smell of disinfectant mixed with the lingering aroma of cafeteria coffee created that familiar hospital cocktail that usually comforted me, but not today. Not when she was whispering loud enough for everyone to hear. "You are not qualified for this position, and frankly, I'm questioning how you even got hired." Her manicured finger tapped against the metal chart holder with each word, creating a rhythm that matched my racing heartbeat. The other nurses at the station, Maria, Jennifer, and Dr. Peterson, who was reviewing charts, all stopped what they were doing. The silence felt thick as Chicago's winter fog rolling off Lake Michigan. I felt my face burning with humiliation as patients in wheelchairs and family members walking by turned to stare. This was Northwestern Memorial Hospital, one of the most prestigious medical centers in the Midwest, and here I was being dressed down like a first-year nursing student who'd forgotten to check vitals. But Margaret had picked the wrong person on the wrong day. My hand instinctively went to my scrub pocket where I always kept my most precious possession, the letter that changed my life. "Actually, Margaret," I said, pulling out the folded document, "I think you might want to see this before you continue making assumptions about my qualifications." The certification letter from the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation was pristine despite being carried in my pocket for 3 months. I unfolded it carefully, the official seal catching the harsh hospital lighting. Licensed registered nurse. Passed the NCLEX-RN with a score of 95%, specialized in intensive care and emergency medicine. I read it aloud, my voice growing stronger with each word. Margaret's face shifted from smug confidence to something I couldn't quite read. Was that fear? The bustling sounds of the hospital, monitors beeping, phones ringing, the distant chatter from the emergency department, seemed to fade into background noise as she snatched the letter from my hands. Her eyes scanned the document quickly, too quickly, like someone looking for something specific rather than reading for comprehension. This doesn't match what's in our system," she stammered, her perfectly styled blonde hair suddenly looking disheveled despite not moving. She pulled out her tablet, fingers flying across the screen with an urgency that made my stomach drop. The sweet smell of hand sanitizer from the dispenser nearby couldn't mask the sour taste of dread creeping up my throat. Something was very wrong here, and it wasn't my qualifications. "According to our records, you have a certification from a community college in Iowa, not the University of Illinois at Chicago," Margaret continued, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening than her earlier public humiliation. The other nurses were pretending to work, but I could feel their ears tuned to every word. Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly patient being wheeled past in her hospital gown, even slowed her pace to listen. This was becoming a spectacle, and I was the unwilling star of a show I never auditioned for. I looked over her shoulder at the tablet screen, and my blood turned to ice water. There, in the hospital's employee database, was my photo attached to someone else's credentials. The name was mine, but everything else, education, certification numbers, even my previous work experience, had been completely altered. Instead of my degree from UIC's prestigious nursing program, it showed a certification from some community college I'd never heard of. Instead of my 5 years of experience in trauma centers across Chicago, it listed me as having worked at a small clinic in rural Iowa. "That's not my file," I whispered, pointing at the screen with a trembling finger. Margaret's reaction was immediate and telling. She slammed the tablet shut and took a step back, her high heels clicking against the polished linoleum floor like gunshots in the suddenly quiet hallway. "I'll need to verify this with administration," she said, but her tone had changed completely. Gone was the condescending authority figure from moments before. Now she sounded like someone who'd been caught with their hand in the cookie jar. The scent of her expensive perfume, something floral and overwhelming, couldn't hide the fact that she was starting to sweat despite the hospital's aggressive air conditioning. "You do that," I replied, folding my certification letter carefully and placing it back in my pocket. But as Margaret hurried away, her heels echoing down the corridor past the patient rooms with their half-open doors and whispered conversations, I realized this wasn't just about my qualifications. Someone had deliberately altered my records in the system. But why? And more importantly, who else's records had been changed? The thought sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the hospital's temperature control. As I stood there at the nursing station, surrounded by the familiar chaos of monitors beeping, nurses rushing between rooms, and the distant sound of an ambulance approaching the emergency bay, I couldn't shake the feeling that I just stumbled onto something much bigger than a simple HR mix-up. The taste of institutional coffee from the break room seemed bitter in my mouth as I realized that my perfect certification letter might have just saved my job, but it might have also painted a target on my back. Have you experienced discrimination in your workplace? Leave us your comment, and don't forget to subscribe to learn how this story continues. 3 days passed before I could bring myself to dig deeper into what I discovered. The night shift at Northwestern Memorial always felt different. Quieter corridors, dimmer lighting, and fewer administrators prowling around. The smell of reheated pizza from the break room mixed with the ever-present antiseptic as I sat at the computer terminal, officially updating patient charts but secretly investigating my own employment records. My hands trembled slightly as I navigated through the system, each click feeling like I was opening Pandora's box. The soft hum of the ventilation system and distant beeping of monitors created a soundtrack for what felt like the most important detective work of my life. I wasn't alone in my suspicions. During lunch break in the cramped staff room with its flickering fluorescent light and motivational posters about hand hygiene, I'd casually mentioned my HR encounter to a few colleagues. That's when Maria Gonzalez, a night shift nurse from the cardiac unit, dropped her turkey sandwich and stared at me with wide eyes. "Something similar happened to me last month," she whispered, glancing around to make sure we weren't overheard. The taste of my own sandwich, dry hospital cafeteria bread with processed meat, suddenly turned to sawdust in my mouth as she continued. "They questioned my certification during my performance review, so the records didn't match what they had on file. 2 hours later, as we walked through the underground tunnel that connected the main hospital to the parking garage, a route that smelled of concrete dust and car exhaust, Maria told me her story. Like me, she was a highly qualified nurse with years of experience and impeccable credentials. Like me, she found discrepancies in her employee file that made her look underqualified. But unlike me, she hadn't had her original certification letter to prove her case. "I just accepted their version," she admitted, her voice echoing off the tunnel walls, painted that institutional green color that reminded me of old subway stations. I thought maybe I'd misremembered my qualifications. The pattern became clearer when I reached out to Keisha Williams from the pediatric ICU. We met at a small diner on North Clark Street, the kind of place that served coffee strong enough to wake the dead and pie that tasted like someone's grandmother made it. The neon sign outside cast pink and blue light through the rain-streaked windows as she confirmed my worst fears. "They've been targeting us," she said, stirring cream into her coffee with hands that had saved countless children's lives. "Look around. It's always the Latina nurses, the black nurses, the ones with accents or names that don't sound American enough." The smell of bacon grease and maple syrup from nearby tables couldn't mask the bitter taste of realization settling in my stomach. That night, I couldn't sleep in my studio apartment in Lincoln Park. The sound of late-night traffic on Lakeshore Drive usually lulled me to rest, but now every car horn and distant siren felt like a warning. I sat at my small kitchen table, surrounded by printed emails, certification documents, and notes scribbled on napkins from the diner. The harsh light from my laptop screen illuminated what was becoming an undeniable truth. Someone at Northwestern Memorial was systematically altering the employment records of qualified minority nurses. But why? What did they gain from making us look incompetent? The next morning, I arrived at work early and volunteered to help with administrative tasks, something I'd never done before, but it gave me access to areas of the hospital I normally wouldn't see. The administrative wing smelled different, less antiseptic, more like coffee and copy machine toner. I noticed how the cleaning crew, mostly Hispanic women who arrived before dawn, nodded respectfully to the white administrators but seemed to avoid eye contact with others. One of them, an older woman named Rosa who I'd seen mopping floors for years, pulled me aside near the supply closet that reeked of industrial cleaning chemicals. "Ten cuidado, mija," she whispered in rapid Spanish, glancing nervously down the hallway lined with official portraits of hospital board members, all white men in expensive suits. "They think we don't understand English, but we hear everything." Some nurses who asked too many questions They don't work here anymore." The weight of her words hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just about altered records. People were losing their jobs, their careers, their ability to feed their families. The taste of the morning coffee from the break room turned acid in my mouth as I realized how deep this conspiracy might go. I spent my lunch break in the medical library, a quiet space that smelled of old books and fresh printing, researching nursing employment practices and discrimination cases. The leather chairs were worn from years of residence studying for board exams, and the silence was broken only by the soft clicking of computer keyboards and turning pages. That's when I found it. A pattern of complaints filed with the Illinois Department of Human Rights over the past 2 years, all from Northwestern Memorial, all from nurses whose qualifications had suddenly been questioned. Maria's name was there. Keisha's name was there. At least 15 others I recognized from the hallways and break rooms. But here's what made my blood run cold a Chicago wind in January. Not one of these complaints had been investigated. Every single case had been dismissed for lack of evidence or insufficient documentation. Someone with serious power was protecting this operation, and that someone had connections that reached far beyond the hospital walls. As I printed the documents, the ancient printer groaning and wheezing like a patient on life support, I realized I wasn't just fighting HR bureaucracy. I was up against a machine designed to chew up nurses like me and spit us out without anyone noticing or caring. The elevator ride back to my floor felt like descending into enemy territory. Each ding of the floor indicator reminded me that I was now carrying dangerous knowledge. The familiar smells of the medical floor, antiseptic, hand sanitizer, the faint aroma of the lunch cart wheeling past, took on a sinister quality. As I passed Margaret's office, I could hear her voice through the partially open door, speaking in hushed tones to someone about cleaning house and maintaining standards. The phrase made my skin crawl because I was beginning to understand exactly what those standards meant. Margaret's office felt like stepping into a predator's den when I knocked on her door the following Monday morning. The space reeked of expensive vanilla candles trying to mask the underlying smell of fear and desperation that seemed to seep from the beige walls covered with motivational posters about team excellence and professional standards. Her mahogany desk was cluttered with personnel files, too many files for someone who claimed to be questioning just my qualifications. The sight of those manila folders with names I recognized made my stomach twist into knots tighter than the Chicago L train schedule during rush hour. "I've been doing some research," I said, placing a thick folder of my own on her desk. The sound it made hitting the wood was satisfying, like dropping a gauntlet in medieval times. Margaret's perfectly manicured fingers froze over her keyboard, her French tips clicking nervously against the plastic keys. Through her office window, I could see the Chicago River reflecting the gray October sky, and somehow the view felt ominous rather than peaceful. Interesting patterns in employee terminations over the past 18 months. Would you like to explain why 15 qualified minority nurses have suddenly had their credentials questioned? Her face went pale under her foundation, the kind of makeup counter beige that costs more than most people's weekly grocery budget. "I don't know what you're implying," she stammered, but her eyes darted to a locked filing cabinet in the corner like a guilty child looking toward where they'd hidden the broken vase. The smell of her coffee, some expensive blend that probably cost more than a hospital cafeteria meal, couldn't mask the sour scent of her fear. I'd seen that look before, in the emergency room when family members realized their loved one wasn't going to make it home for Christmas dinner. "I'm not implying anything," I replied, opening my folder and spreading documents across her pristine desk like playing cards in a high-stakes poker game. "I'm stating facts. Maria Gonzalez, 15 years of experience, suddenly fired for credential discrepancies. Keisha Williams, graduated summa cum laude from Northwestern's own nursing program, terminated for qualification concerns." Should I continue? The air conditioning hummed overhead, but sweat was beginning to bead on Margaret's forehead despite the cool temperature that kept the administrative wing comfortable while the rest of us worked in stifling heat. Margaret stood up abruptly, her chair rolling backward and hitting the wall with a thud that echoed through the small office. "You need to stop this investigation immediately," she hissed, her professional facade cracking like old paint on a Chicago brownstone. "You don't understand the bigger picture here." But as she moved toward the filing cabinet, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. A key hanging from a chain around her neck, half hidden beneath her silk blouse. The kind of key that opened more than just filing cabinets. What bigger picture? I pressed, standing my ground despite every instinct telling me to run. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed like insects, and I could hear the distant sound of a code blue being called over the hospital intercom. Someone fighting for their life while we discussed systematic discrimination. The one where qualified nurses lose their jobs, so you can replace them with. I paused, pieces clicking together in my mind like a jigsaw puzzle revealing a horrible image. With whom exactly, Margaret? Who's taking these positions? Her laugh was bitter, like the taste of medicine that's supposed to help but only makes you feel worse. You think this is about discrimination? She moved to her computer, fingers flying over the keyboard with practiced ease. This is about survival. Budget cuts, insurance pressures, administrative costs. Do you have any idea how much a fully credentialed nurse costs this hospital compared to? She stopped herself, but it was too late. The truth was spilling out like blood from a punctured artery. Compared to what? I demanded, moving around the desk to see her computer screen. What I saw there made me grab the edge of the desk for support. Spreadsheets filled with salary comparisons, recruitment costs, and what looked like a price list for different levels of nursing credentials. But the most damning document was an email chain between Margaret and someone identified only as J. Morrison discussing Phase 2 implementation and target reduction of 40% in nursing costs by Q4. Margaret slammed the laptop shut, but not before I'd seen enough to understand the scope of what was happening. You're replacing qualified nurses with cheaper, less credentialed staff, I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. People are dying because of this, aren't they? The thought of Mrs. Patterson from last week, the elderly woman who'd coded during what should have been a routine medication administration, suddenly took on a sinister new meaning. Nobody's dying, Margaret snapped, but her voice cracked like a teenager caught in a lie. The replacements are adequately trained, they just don't have the expensive certifications that drive up our labor costs. It's a business decision. She moved to the filing cabinet, key in hand, but I was faster. Years of emergency room reflexes served me well as I blocked her path, close enough to smell her desperation mixing with that vanilla candle scent. Show me the files, I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. Show me the credentials of the people you've hired to replace us. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire, broken only by the sound of someone wheeling a patient down the hallway outside, their wheels squeaking against the polished linoleum. Through the window, storm clouds were gathering over Lake Michigan, and I could taste the electricity in the air that promised rain. Margaret's shoulders sagged in defeat as she unlocked the cabinet. Inside were personnel files for dozens of people I'd never seen before, people with nursing certificates from schools I'd never heard of, people whose employment started the same weeks that qualified nurses like Maria and Keisha had been terminated. One file caught my eye. Jennifer Morrison, hired the same day Maria was fired, with credentials from something called Chicago Valley Technical Institute, a school that a quick Google search on my phone revealed didn't exist. How deep does this go? I asked, flipping through files that told a story of systematic replacement and cost-cutting that put patients' lives at risk. Margaret sank into her chair like a deflated balloon, her perfectly styled hair beginning to fall from its professional arrangement. The storm outside chose that moment to unleash its fury, rain pelting against the window like bullets, and I realized that I was standing in the eye of a hurricane that was about to tear through Northwestern Memorial Hospital like nothing anyone had ever seen before. The truth is coming to light. The best is yet to come, so make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a second of this shocking revelation. The rain outside Margaret's office window matched the storm brewing in my chest as I photographed every document in that filing cabinet with my phone. Each click of the camera shutter felt like a nail being hammered into a coffin, not mine, but the coffin of this entire corrupt operation. The vanilla candle had burned down to a stub, its sweet smell now cloying and nauseating as Margaret sat slumped in her chair, watching me document evidence that would destroy careers and possibly send people to prison. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered occasionally, casting shadows that danced across the personnel files like ghosts of the nurses who'd been sacrificed for profit margins. "You don't understand what you're doing," Margaret whispered, her voice hoarse from our 2-hour confrontation. "Dr. Morrison isn't just some administrator. He's connected to the hospital board, to the insurance companies, to people who can make you disappear from the medical field forever. The threat hung in the air like the smell of disinfectant that never quite left hospital walls. Through the window, I could see emergency vehicles in the parking lot, their red and blue lights reflecting off the wet pavement, and I wondered if someone had already called security on me. But I'd gone too far to stop now. The files revealed a conspiracy that made my original suspicions look like child's play. Jennifer Morrison, who turned out to be Dr. Morrison's daughter, wasn't just an underqualified replacement nurse. She was the tip of an iceberg that included fake nursing schools, forged certifications, and a network of graduates who'd been placed in hospitals across the Chicago metropolitan area. The taste of bile rose in my throat as I read incident reports that had been buried, patient complaints that had been dismissed, and mortality statistics that showed a suspicious uptick in preventable deaths at facilities where these replacement nurses worked. "Mrs. Patterson," I said suddenly, the pieces clicking together like a combination lock opening to reveal something horrible. The elderly patient who coded last week during medication administration. That was Jennifer Morrison who gave her the wrong dose, wasn't it? Margaret's silence was answer enough. The sound of my own heartbeat seemed to echo in the small office as I realized that real people, grandmothers, fathers, children, had died because qualified nurses like me had been systematically removed and replaced with cheap, dangerous imposters. I spent the next 3 hours in the hospital's medical records department, a basement facility that smelled like old paper and felt like a tomb for forgotten patients. Using my legitimate access as a current employee, I pulled files for every patient death that had occurred in the past 18 months. The pattern was undeniable: incidents involving medication errors, missed symptoms, and delayed interventions clustered around the employment dates of Margaret's replacement nurses. Mrs. Patterson wasn't the first victim. She was just the most recent in a string of preventable deaths that stretched back to when this cost-cutting scheme had begun. The security cameras in the medical records room hummed quietly as they recorded my every move, but I no longer cared about being caught. In my hands were copies of death certificates, incident reports, and family complaints that painted a picture of negligent homicide on an institutional scale. The fluorescent lights down here were older and buzzed more loudly than upstairs, creating an appropriately ominous soundtrack as I documented evidence that would shut down this operation and send its architects to prison. The smell of moldy paper and forgotten files seemed fitting for uncovering secrets that powerful people had buried. My phone buzzed with a text message that made my blood turn to ice water. "Stop what you're doing or face consequences. You've been warned." The number wasn't one I recognized, but the timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Someone was watching me, tracking my movements through the hospital's computer system or security cameras. The basement suddenly felt less like a research facility and more like a trap, with only one stairway leading back to safety, and no idea who might be waiting for me at the top. I made copies of everything: death certificates, incident reports, employment records, financial documents showing payments to fake nursing schools, and sealed them in multiple envelopes. One went to my apartment, hidden in my freezer behind frozen dinners that reminded me of better times, when my biggest worry was what to eat after a 12-hour shift. Another went to a safety deposit box at First National Bank on Michigan Avenue, where it joined my passport and grandmother's jewelry as things too valuable to lose. The third envelope I carried with me as I walked back upstairs, past the familiar smells of antiseptic and cafeteria food that now felt tainted by the knowledge of what was happening in these halls. Dr. Morrison's office was on the executive floor, a realm of thick carpets and oil paintings that felt more like a luxury hotel than a medical facility. The smell here was different too: leather and expensive cologne instead of hospital disinfectant, as if the people who worked here were too important to be reminded that this was a place where people came to heal or die. His secretary, a thin woman with silver hair and the kind of smile that never reached her eyes, tried to tell me he wasn't available. But I walked past her desk like I belonged there, carrying my envelope of evidence like a badge of authority. "Dr. Morrison," I said, pushing open his office door without knocking. The man behind the mahogany desk looked exactly like what you'd expect from someone orchestrating this kind of operation: expensive suit, silver hair perfectly styled, and the kind of tan that comes from golf courses rather than honest work. The view from his corner office showed all of downtown Chicago, Lake Michigan stretching to the horizon like a blue promise of better things beyond this corrupt building. "You must be our troublemaker," he said without looking up from his computer, his voice carrying the kind of casual authority that came from years of never being questioned. "Margaret tells me you've been asking uncomfortable questions." The sound of his fingers on the keyboard was rhythmic, almost hypnotic, like he was typing my termination letter while we spoke. Behind him, framed photographs showed him shaking hands with politicians and hospital board members, a visual reminder of the power structure I was challenging. I placed the envelope on his desk with enough force to make his coffee cup rattle in its saucer. 15 qualified nurses fired and replaced with dangerous imposters. At least 8 preventable patient deaths. Financial fraud involving fake nursing schools. Insurance fraud. Negligent homicide. Each accusation fell like a hammer blow, and for the first time since entering his office, Dr. Morrison looked up from his computer screen. His eyes were the color of Lake Michigan during a winter storm, cold, gray, and potentially deadly. "You're going to take that envelope and walk away," he said quietly, standing up to reveal a height that had probably intimidated countless people over the years. "You're going to forget everything you think you've discovered, and you're going to be grateful that you still have a job tomorrow morning. Because the alternative is that you become another casualty of budget cuts, and trust me, nobody will question your termination after the performance issues we'll document in your file." But I'd been preparing for this moment since I first saw my altered employment records. "Actually, Dr. Morrison, you're going to call an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. You're going to confess to everything and help us identify every fake nurse you've placed in Chicago area hospitals. And you're going to do it because copies of this evidence are already in the hands of the FBI, the Illinois Department of Health, the Chicago Tribune, and my attorney." The lie rolled off my tongue like truth, because sometimes the right lie serves justice better than the wrong truth. His face went through several colors, red with anger, white with fear, then a sickly green that reminded me of patients about to vomit. Through his window, the city lights were beginning to twinkle as evening approached, and I realized that by tomorrow night, those lights would be illuminating newspaper headlines about the biggest healthcare fraud scandal in Chicago's history. The taste of victory was sweet, but it was tempered by the bitter knowledge of how many people had suffered for profit margins and executive bonuses. "Who are you?" he whispered, sinking back into his leather chair like a man who just realized his empire was crumbling. "What do you really want?" I smiled for the first time in weeks, thinking of Mrs. Patterson and all the other patients who deserved better than fake nurses and corporate greed. "I'm just a qualified nurse who refuses to be silently replaced. And what I want is justice for everyone you've hurt and prevention of future harm to patients who trust this hospital with their lives." The next morning's Chicago Tribune headline read Northwestern Memorial Hospital Scandal. Fake nurses, real deaths, in letters large enough to see from across Michigan Avenue. Dr. Morrison resigned before the FBI arrived to arrest him, but Margaret wasn't so lucky. She was led away in handcuffs during the morning shift change, past nurses and doctors who finally understood why so many qualified colleagues had mysteriously disappeared. The fake nurses were identified and removed within 48 hours, replaced by properly credentialed professionals who understood that patient care isn't a place to cut corners. Maria got her job back with full back pay and a promotion to charge nurse. Keisha was offered a position in our pediatric ICU that came with the respect she'd always deserved. The families of patients who died due to negligent care filed lawsuits that would ensure this kind of cost-cutting scheme could never happen again, at least not without serious financial consequences that made it unprofitable. As for me, I kept my job, but more importantly, I kept my integrity. The certification letter that started this whole investigation now sits framed in my apartment, not as a symbol of my qualifications, but as a reminder that sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice is simply refusing to accept it. Every morning when I walk through the doors of Northwestern Memorial, past the security cameras, and through the antiseptic-scented hallways, I know that real nurses are caring for real patients, and that makes every 12-hour shift worth it. What's your opinion on healthcare fraud and workplace discrimination? Have you ever had to fight for your professional dignity? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe for more real stories of standing up against corruption and fighting for what's right in our workplaces and communities.